Every morning, Edward walked to work, 15 minutes from his flat to the quiet street where the private library stood. Long enough to stretch his legs, short enough to keep the day unhurried. He liked the rhythm of it, the same corners, the same shop windows, the same elm by the gate of the college garden. In the afternoons, he walked the same way back home. The library where he worked was not public, but private, a modest institution supported by an old trust. Its collection focused on medieval medicine and the history of healing. The shelves smelled of vellum and dust. The windows were tall and thin. The silence was companionable rather than lonely. Edward had been there for 32 years, long enough that his hands moved through the building as if it were an extension of his own memory. He catalogued, repaired bindings, cleaned spines, and answered the occasional letter from a scholar abroad. The work suited him. It asked for patience and rewarded care. He was 55 now, and the thought of living alone no longer troubled him. His flat, spacious, high-ceilinged, faintly echoing, filled the space that other people might fill with company. He had bought it 3 decades earlier, when he was barely 25. The price had been improbably low. That part of the building had suffered a fire, and the insurance company that owned it had preferred to sell rather than restore. Edward had taken it as he found it. Walls scorched, plaster flaking, the scent of smoke still lingering in the floorboards. Little by little, he rebuilt it. He hired specialists for the plumbing and the electrics, but everything else, the sanding, painting, shelving, he did himself. Over the years, he had come to think of every corner as his own work. The apartment served his purposes perfectly. It had room for his books, thousands of them, a workbench where he restored or cleaned old volumes, and light that fell kindly across the pages. Sometimes, as he left in the morning, he paused on the landing and glanced back through the half-open door. The flat looked ordered and quiet, its walls lined with shelves and careful stacks. It felt complete, sufficient, a world of its own. That afternoon, he carried a recently restored book back to the library, wrapped in brown paper and string. The air was still warm, the last edge of summer softening the pavement. He walked at his usual pace, steady and unhurried, the bundle tucked under one arm, the sunlight glinting through the railings. For Edward, it was an ordinary day, one that began, as always, with books and silence, and would end the same way. The day had passed as usual, calmly, silently. Edward worked through the afternoon in the library's upper room, sorting a small set of bindings that needed attention. Outside, the light shifted from gold to gray. By the time he locked the door behind him, Oxford had settled into its familiar late afternoon hush. On the walk home, he let his eyes wander over the old facades. Every street carried layers of history. Stone and time were stitched together here. He sometimes thought Oxford was the quiet heart of civilization, and that his work, preserving the words and records of its past, was, in its own small way, a part of keeping that civilization alive. In the hallway of his building, he stopped at the row of narrow mailboxes. Inside his was the usual assortment: a few bills, the weekly literary review, and the morning newspaper. He smiled faintly. He always read the morning news with his evening tea, one day behind the rest of the world. The delay suited him. As he gathered the papers, a single envelope slipped from the bundle and fluttered to the floor. He bent to pick it up. The name written across it read, Edward Harris. He frowned. Postman can't even read anymore, he muttered, amused at the mistake. His own name was Edward James. Harris didn't even begin with the same letter. But then he paused. The address was correct. Perfectly correct. The letter had been delivered to the right door, only the name was wrong. He carried the post inside, set the rest of the mail on his desk, and turned his attention to the stray envelope. It wasn't new. The paper had yellowed slightly, the corners soft. But it wasn't ancient either. It had the look of something written perhaps 20, 30 years ago. He remembered that kind of envelope from his youth. The thin blue-gray sort meant for airmail, the kind that folded neatly into itself. The handwriting was careful, slightly slanted, written with a steady hand. He guessed it was a man's. The strokes were firm, deliberate, without the rounded flourishes he often saw in women's script from the same era. A practical hand, trained to write clearly rather than beautifully. He turned it over once more. The stamp was faded, the postmark British. No return address. "Why has this come now?" he murmured to himself. The letter lay on his table, quietly insistent, as if waiting for him to decide what to do. For the next 3 days, the letter refused to leave Edward alone. It sat on the corner of his desk at home, beside a stack of reference catalogues, its presence small but persistent. Even at the library, while cleaning bindings or updating inventory cards, his thoughts drifted back to it. He caught himself rereading the name in his mind, Edward Harris, as if the repetition might shake loose a memory. At last, he gave in to the distraction. On the library's computer, he typed the name into a search engine. Dozens of results appeared within Oxford alone. Researchers, teachers, pensioners, a painter, a retired surgeon. Across the United Kingdom, there were hundreds more, and even several in America linked to the university. He scrolled through them methodically, noting dates and professions, but there was no way to tell which, if any, might be connected to his address. That evening he turned to something more concrete: the history of his flat. He still kept the purchase papers in a neat folder. The name of the seller was not an individual, but an insurance company, the same one that had handled the property after the fire 30 years earlier. There was nothing before that, no personal deed or signature. The next morning he stopped by the land registry office near St. Aldate's. The file there was brief. The flat had been registered to the insurance company, then transferred to him. Nothing earlier. When he asked about the missing records, the clerk explained in a polite, matter-of-fact tone that older properties often had incomplete documentation. Compulsory registration only really took hold in the 90s, she said. Many of the earlier deeds were never digitized, or were simply lost when ownership changed hands. Edward thanked her and left, unsatisfied but not surprised. That afternoon he tried the insurance company itself, though the name on his papers no longer existed. After 2 transfers and a merger, the new firm occupied a glass building on the edge of the city. A courteous young representative listened to his query and then, after a brief pause, gave the expected answer. "I'm afraid we can't release information about former policyholders, even if the claim was decades ago." "Data protection rules," he nodded. "Of course." "I understand." There was nothing more to say. Walking back through Oxford, he felt neither disappointment nor excitement, only a small, persistent unease. The city looked unchanged. Bicycles in motion, the scent of coffee drifting from the cafes, students leaning against sun-warmed walls. Yet for him there was now a blank space in the story of his own home, a missing line in an otherwise tidy catalogue. That evening, as he let himself in, the envelope waited on the table exactly where he had left it. He stood for a long moment, then decided. He would open it tonight. He knew how to do it properly, carefully, without tearing the flap, without disturbing a single fiber of paper. After 3 days of searching, he would finally read what words had traveled so far, and for so long, to find him. Edward cleared a space on his table before he began. He moved a stack of catalogues to one side, drew the lamp closer, and let the warm pool of light settle over the envelope. Then, from the drawer where he kept his restoration tools, he took out a pair of thin cotton gloves. The gesture was habitual, the same care he used when handling old manuscripts or fragile bindings. He slipped the gloves on slowly, smoothing the fingertips so there would be no accidental crease or smudge. Then he picked up the letter. The paper felt dry but sound. The gum on the flap cracked with age. He turned it over once or twice, examining the fold and the edges. From another compartment of the drawer, he selected a narrow bone folder, its surface worn satin smooth by decades of use. Holding it lightly between his fingers, he let it warm for a moment in his hand before sliding it, millimeter by millimeter, under the sealed flap. The sound was barely there, just the faintest whisper as the fibers parted. He paused often, coaxing the adhesive to release rather than break, lifting each section of the flap until it eased away cleanly. The paper yielded with surprising grace, the fold opening like a breath held too long. When he was finished, he examined the edge carefully. There was no tear, no roughness. If he pressed it closed again, it would seal neatly, leaving no sign that anyone had ever intervened. He rested the bone folder beside him and paused, as though acknowledging that he had crossed a quiet threshold. Then, still gloved, he drew the single folded sheet from within. The ink was soft blue-gray, the handwriting steady and deliberate. At the top of the page, the first line waited, clear beneath the lamplight. "Most likely you will not read this any more, my dear Edward. I know that you have been unwell, and that time may not allow this letter to find you. Still, I wanted to write, not for an answer, but to say what should be said, while there is still the chance to put it into words. I wish to thank you for your kindness, for the patience and encouragement you showed me when I had almost given up on life. It was your quiet insistence that life need not close itself so early that gave me the courage to try once more. And so I did. Some months ago I traveled to France. You may remember I spoke of Valerie. And I asked her, quite simply, if she would be willing to share her life with a man like me. Perhaps you saw it before I did. Perhaps you even expected it. But she said yes. It seems that she had been waiting, hoping, and I had only to ask. I never imagined that I could find love again at the age of 55, yet here I am, humbled and grateful. None of it would have happened without your steady friendship and your belief that it is never too late to begin anew. Wherever you are when these words reach you, if they reach you, know that I remain thankful. You have my affection and my respect, always. Your colleague and friend, James. He drew a slow breath, the paper trembling faintly between his gloved fingers. A letter to Edward, signed by James. His own names, divided neatly between two men. For a moment, he simply stared at the page, feeling the small shock of coincidence ripple through him. He laid the letter flat on the table and removed his gloves, setting them carefully beside the lamp. The air in the room seemed different now, still expectant. He rubbed at the bridge of his nose, then looked again at the handwriting, as though to confirm what he had seen. There it was, your colleague and friend, James. He told himself it was only chance. Oxford was full of Edwards and Jameses, but the thought refused to settle. A letter to Edward, from James. Edward James. He pushed the paper aside, stood, and walked once around the room. Yet within a minute he was back at the table, reading the letter again from the beginning. Each line seemed to speak more directly than before, as if the words had been waiting for him. He was not the right Edward, nor was he the James who had written. But somehow, impossibly, he was both. Edward sat for a long time after finishing the letter. The lamplight made a small circle on the table. Beyond it, the room rested in quiet shadow. He felt composed, yet something within him had shifted, a faint, deliberate rearranging of the familiar order. For 3 decades he had lived within steady lines, the flat, the library, the streets between them. Books had filled the spaces that people might have filled. It had seemed enough. But the letter's voice unsettled that certainty. Its gratitude, its late-found happiness, felt oddly personal. Perhaps it is not too late for me either, he thought, half amused by the idea, half moved by it. He refolded the sheet, slid it back into its envelope, and set it carefully aside. As he gathered the rest of the post into order, another envelope caught his attention. Heavier paper. A printed return address from the small bookshop on Walton Street. He received such envelopes often, and they usually went straight to the drawer unopened. This time, without quite knowing why, he took the paper knife from his desk and slit it open. Inside was a neatly folded invitation, printed in dark blue ink on cream card. The words were familiar: an evening with the author, refreshments to follow. But one line made him pause. "We would be delighted to see you join us." He read the title twice before it settled in his mind. Beneath Paris. A newly published novel. Fiction. Not his genre at all. He gave a quiet, amused breath. For years he had thought of fiction as something ornamental, an indulgence for people with more time or softer inclinations. Women, he thought suddenly. Women had always seemed to understand it better. They spoke about novels with ease, as if they were extensions of life itself, finding meanings between emotions rather than facts. Once he had considered that sentimental. Now it struck him as another kind of wisdom. He held the card a moment longer, the paper warm from his hand. Perhaps fiction was not mere invention. Perhaps, like love, it asked only to be believed in a little. He placed the invitation beside the letter and smiled faintly to himself. Maybe it was time to allow a little fiction too, and all that might come with it, into his own life. That evening, he laid his coat across the chair, ready for tomorrow.
Magdalene bells fading across the green, punts on the cherwell drifting unseen. The city turns pages in twilight's hush, and something unread gathers in my chest. I thought my story was written and done, just ink on a page that had lost its sun. But the night's unfolding, a new chapter beginning, and I'm walking to life with a new defining. A letter delivered by destiny's mistake. 2 names on the paper made me awake. A hand from the past, a voice unknown. Somehow the message was meant for my soul. It spoke of love, found when the hour was late, of a heart rediscovering light in fate. The words were for others, yet somehow they stayed, and I felt them unfold in the life I delayed. I thought my story was written and done, just ink on a page that had lost its sun. But the night's unfolding, a new chapter beginning, and I'm walking to life with a new defining. Life had been paused, pages gathering dust, dreams left unread on a shelf one could trust. But a letter of fate found the space once sealed, and destiny whispered, life is real. There's laughter inside and a shimmer of joy, excitement I'd missed since I was a boy. A novel beneath Paris holds stories untold, and I step through the doorway, my smile unfolds. I thought my story was written and done, just ink on a page that had lost its sun. But the night's unfolding, a new chapter beginning, and I'm walking to life with a new defining. The air feels lighter, the pages align, stories and faces all meeting with mine. The night holds a whisper both gentle and true, that every tomorrow begins something new.